Thank you all for joining us tonight. This is Mike's second presentation with us via Zoom. Earlier in the month, he did Orchids of Indiana, and it was really a fascinating presentation. So Mike, thank you for being here with us tonight.
My pleasure.
Great. So Mike served as a botanist and plant ecologist for the Indiana Department of Natural Resources Division of Nature Preserves for 37 years before retiring in 2019. He has written over 75 scientific papers, popular articles, and books about Indiana's natural features, including Orchids of Indiana, Wildflowers and Ferns of Indiana Forests, a field guide, Wake Up Woods, and Wildflowers of the Midwest in press right now. He is a board member and past president of Indiana Native Plant Society. Thank you, Mike. Take it away.
Okay. Thank you, Brooke. Good evening, everyone. I hope you had a chance to get outdoors and enjoy the early blooming spring wildflowers that are really coming on strong right now. I happened to be able to get out today, and I saw white trout lilies and Dutchman's breeches, bellwort, spring beauty, all those really cool early flowering plants. And even one fern actually starting to come up. So things are truly happening. Of course, you know, it's going to get cold tomorrow. So hope you enjoyed today. So let's talk about ferns. I think last time I may have stated, I don't know if I did or not, that orchids are certainly one of my favorite groups of plants, maybe the very favorite group. It goes back and forth. I'd certainly include ferns in that group of favorites. And I'm going to talk about what I would clearly state is my favorite all-time Indiana fern, but you're going to have to wait till the end of the presentation here, so hold on to your seats. So let's talk about Ferns of Indiana. But how I'm going to start off with something a little unusual. You all know about these Rorschach tests. You look at them and you tell the psychiatrist what you see, and that they're going to get analyzed. And look at this, and I want you to tell me what you see. And I hope that you see a fern of some sort in there. Do you? You don't have to answer that question. But do you see a fern in this picture? Maybe. How about this one? Do you see anything that look like a fern?
Yes.
Okay, maybe they do, but how do you know those are ferns? Well, that's what we hope to clarify here a little bit. What makes a fern a fern? Well, here are some characterizations of ferns. They're usually lacy, highly dissected leaves or blades. Not always. As you'll see later, we have some that are totally non-dissected, non-lacy. The new leaves often unfurl or unfold as fiddleheads, look like the top of a cello or a violin, curled up, and they'll uncurl as they develop, which the botanists call circinate vernation. They don't have flowers, no seeds, no fruits, no seeds. That's really critical because most of the plants that you see in our landscape do produce flowers, and most do produce seeds of some sort. Ferns instead produce spores, those sorts of things like you would expect a fungus to produce. And we'll explain a little bit more about what a spore is. In Indiana, most are forest dwelling. They're rooted in the soil.
It would just log you in at the first time and not have to do 15 times log you in.
So, and they're also terrestrial, whether they're in the forest or not. Some are in wetlands, some actually are floating plants. One species in Indiana occurs as an epiphyte, and others are rock obligates. Epiphytes being plants which grow upon other plants. And we have one species in particular that does that somewhat routinely, at least farther south it does. And in Indiana, we have about 80 species of ferns plus minus, which is about twice as many native orchids as we have in the state. I mentioned that this new frond, this new leaf, as it just emerges, comes up as a coil and it starts to unfurl. And that was that fiddlehead that we commonly refer to as the structure seen in the picture. And here it is on a different fern, different species, a small little fern frond as it starts to unfurl. Often we refer to that big fern leaf as a frond. So let's look at these different structures here, just to give you a brief tutorial about the fern morphology. So here is a full fern frond. See here, we often refer to the leaf as a frond, which includes the blade. That's where the green tissue is, the leaf-like tissue that we're familiar with. Then this long stalk, which is also sometimes referred to as a stipe, and the rhizomes in which it's connected. And then each leaflet of the frond we'll call a pinna. That's, again, fern speak, but you don't need to know that right now. And they can be either totally with a separate little stalk, or they can just be a lobe on the pinna. And we'll call those little sub-leaflets, we'll call those pinnules. And I'm not going to refer to those again in this talk, most likely, but if you really want to look into fern morphology and use keys to identify ferns and so forth, it would be helpful to know those. What I especially would like you to see, what is typically underneath that leaf of the fern frond and on the leaflets and leaf sub-leaflets are these structures here, which are called spore clusters. You may have heard them and seen them referred to in some books as fruit dots. They're not fruit. They do though have dots. Technically, they're not fruits. We'll call them spore clusters, or in fern speak again, a sporangium. And within each of those sporangia, you'll have the spores. And here you can see on this, you can see the little black dots. Look like almost caviar, perhaps, to you. That, each of those would be the sporangia, and within those would be the spores themselves. So that's a little quick tutorial. So how do ferns reproduce? Because that's critical. We talked about spores, and that's the big part of this reproduction of ferns. And for many, many years, it was unknown how ferns reproduce because no one could find any seeds. No one saw any fruit. And so, as this quote here from Shakespeare talks about, we walk invisible. In other words, they just didn't know how ferns reproduced. Well, it was, and they were referred to, these fern plants and others in their group, as cryptogams, which broken down means hidden marriage. Again, it was unknown how ferns would reproduce. Okay, that's the racy stuff. Now, here we're going to get into the real nitty-gritty, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this because this is such an interesting part of the fern's life cycle. Here's the frond we know and love. And remember, we said on the undersurface are these dots where the sori, they're called sori, plural, sorus if you're talking about an individual one. And it's there where those sporangia, or sporangium for singular, that holds the spores occur. Now, just a little bit of genetics here. The ferns are diploid. They include the full set, the full complement of chromosomes. But you might remember from your biology days that when there's meiosis occurring and these spores are produced, they're haploid. They're only half the number of spore or chromosomes that the parent plant would have. Well, those spores are dispersed. Typically, they're just so tiny dust-like that they float around in the air or land on just beneath the plant into suitable substrate in order to germinate. And this is what's fascinating. They form a different phase of the plant. It's another plant in a sense. It's like a fern lives a double life. And this other life we call the gametophyte. It's a little plantlet, sometimes no bigger than your fingernail in size. And most people have never seen them. They're somewhat secretive in that sense. And it's there where the sexual organs are formed. And if the egg and the sperm get together on this gametophyte, you would then form a sporophyte. And it would refer back to the original parent being a diploid sporophyte. This new one now is a diploid, has the full complement of chromosomes. So this is sort of the fern cycle of life here. Now, there are other ways in which ferns can reproduce, and we'll talk a little bit about those, but this is the classic fertile reproduction of a fern. So you go from the diploid sporophytes to the haploid gametophytes, where the fertilization takes place and the new sporophyte is formed. It's often referred to as the alternation of generations. Here you can see on the undersurface of a wood fern, of Dryopteris, where those spore clusters are found. These little flaps of tissue that cover up all those sporangia is called an indusium. Again, you don't need to know that for now. And then that caviar looking stuff, those are the sporangia in which the spores occur. And here's another way in which there can be formed and displayed. This is on a Christmas fern. And all those tannish looking structures there are where the sporangia are, where the spores are formed. Typically, it is on the undersurface of the leaf tissue, but not always. So here's our sporophyte. This is the fern frond that we know and love, and that's where the spores are produced. And if they fall on suitable substrate, which here it's on a cliff in a little pocket of that rock base, you can see where the gametophytes are, and they're just little green flaps of tissue. And that's probably at most a quarter of an inch in width. Tiny little structure, a little plant. And here is one here. And there is the beginning of a tiny little sporophyte, the new fern frond. And this one I call the Valentine fern. I just made that up. But that's the new sporophyte, which will develop into something like the larger, more classic fern frond. So let's just look at some of the ferns and some of the environments in which they grow. Some ferns really like to grow on rock, big rock faces. Some are even obligate rock dwelling species. We'll look at some of those. The two main rock types we have in Indiana, sandstone, which is generally acidic environment. And then we'll also look at limestone. But first, let's look at the sandstone. These are the big giant cliffs that you see at Turkey Run State Park. If you've been down south into Hemlock Cliffs, for instance, or Yellow Birch Ravine, several areas of big cliff overhangs and cliff faces. You can see here how the ferns really are doing quite well on the ledges of this rock face. And one of them that, at least on the more moist cliffs, is the intermediate wood fern, or lacy wood fern, I sometimes call it, Dryopterus intermedia. And there's several species in the genus Dryopterus, or again, we call them wood ferns a lot of times, just generically or in a common sense. Very lacy, very typical looking fern frond. Limestone, this is a limestone cliff. You know, it's very basic in pH, lots of calcium carbonate, and certain ferns really are adapted to and prefer that environment. This is just a small limestone cliff here. You can find something called the purple cliff break. This fern is, each individual frond might be 6 inches typically, 4 to 6 on average, but not a large fern, but almost always on limestone. On the moist limestone cliffs is what's called bulblet ferns, Cystopteris bulbifera. This long, graceful, tapering frond. And if you've been in anywhere where there's limestone, like in McCormick's Creek State Park, for instance, you could see quite a few of these bulblet ferns. And they call it bulblet fern because of the production of what are called bulblets on the stalk. And this is a form of asexual reproduction. These bulblets can fall to the ground or on some portion of a cliff and grow into a new plant. This is at McCormick's Creek State Park. You may recognize this site. This is in an area where they actually quarried limestone, as I understand it, for our state capitol. And here you can even see some of the holes that were drilled. I don't know if they intended, maybe these were holes to drill for blasting and just decided not to, I don't know. But here's bulblet fern growing out of each of those holes. They're obviously not artificial, they're not naturally occurring holes. I'm being a little facetious here. The colorful world of spleenworts, that's a group of mostly small ferns. And the only thing that's colorful about them is that if you like green, you'd think they're colorful because they're all green. And here's a list of several of the spleenworts of the genus Asplenium. These are all small ferns and mostly cliff dwelling, not always, but mostly. There's one called the walrus spleenwort, Asplenium rudimeraria. It's a rare fern. You could see this at Clifty Falls State Park, for instance, growing on some of the rock ledges there. This fern, same species, grows in Europe. And I've seen this on trips to Europe where it's just growing on artificial rock walls, just growing along a street line. It's not necessarily a plant that needs high quality natural area to grow, but here in Indiana, it does. I'd be shocked if you said you found this growing on a cliff somewhere, especially in Indianapolis. In Indiana, it's mostly a far southern Indiana species. Almost all of the occurrences are along the Ohio River. It's a tiny little fern that's maybe 3 inches in length, if you can see my pointer. So it's a small little fern. Here's some leaves of columbine. So it grows in the same environment that you expect to see columbine down in southern Indiana. This is a rare one, although it looks very much like a very common one, but this is a rare one called the black stem spleenwort. Again, just on limestone cliffs bordering the Ohio River. This is the mountain spleenwort. If you go to the eastern parts of Kentucky and Ohio, you'd find this more frequently than in Indiana, because in Indiana, I know of only 2 places where this fern can be found. But again, as you go into the Appalachians, for instance, hence that common name certainly applies for being a mountain spleenwort. Another small plant, that whole group of fronds there would easily fit within the palm of your hand. Now, I suspect many of you may have seen this one if you've taken hikes out in our natural areas, state parks, nature preserves, and so forth, especially if there were rock faces. And it doesn't need to be either it could be either limestone or sandstone, but mostly limestone, called the walking fern. And you can see this large colony here. And this is called walking fern because it makes this long tapering tip. And where that tip touches a surface, a new one is formed. I just for fun called it mother and child. Mother's taking the child out for a walk. So it's a walking fern. And you can imagine that if this happens enough times, if the fronds of this plantlet here grows to this size, and then it arches over and starts to form a new plant, then you get this pattern. And typically you'll see big mats of the walking fern. But notice that's not your typical fern frond. There's nothing lacy about that plant. Another spleenwort, a Splenium platyneuron. You'll notice that so far when we're talking about spleenworts, all start with the genus Asplenium. And this one is the ebony spleenwort. And this one can be actually weedy and quite common. I have found it growing in old fields. I've also seen it in reclaiming strip mine lands. It's a very abundant fern and not at all conservative in terms of its fidelity to a high quality natural area. There was a great botanist, fortunately no longer living, who's in Michigan, named Herb Wagner, who was really somewhat of a botanical genius. And if I understood the story correctly, I had the great fortune of meeting him, and he came to Indiana a few times. He came up with this, what they call the Asplenium triangle. And I understand he did this when he was in high school, which that's the genius part of this. So let's look at the tips of the triangle. Here's a walking fern at the tip. We've seen that. Here's the mountain spleenwort. We saw that one earlier. And here's that weedy ebony spleenwort, Asplenium platyneuron. There's a fern here called the pinnatifid or lobed spleenwort, Asplenium pinnatifidum here. And here is that Bradley spleenwort, Splenium bradleyi. And this one's quite rare in Indiana, but this one's actually fairly common, at least on the cliffs of southern Indiana, especially on sandstone. He determined that it was a fertile hybrid between the walking fern and the mountain spleenwort. And once this hybridization occurred and it became fertile, then it has been considered to be a distinct species. So here you have the walking fern, here you have the mountain spleenwort, and here you have the lobe spleenwort. This is the one that you see most commonly in southern Indiana on sandstone. So there's that lobe spleenwort. There are actually some individuals of this species at Portland Arch Nature Preserve, if you've ever been there, over in west central Indiana. Now, the other one we talked about, here's the mountain spleenwort, here's the ebony spleenwort. There's cross-fertilization to get the Bradley spleenwort. Now, this one's extremely rare. There are only 2 populations of this known in Indiana, and to my recollection, one of them is extirpated. So clearly this is an endangered species within Indiana. Ain't from around here, are you yet? Well, what's that talking about? Well, it's talking about the introduced species that are becoming naturalized in Indiana. Fortunately, so far, not very commonly. It is and has the potential to become extremely invasive and aggressive. Hopefully that won't happen. But this is a fern, as you can gather from the common name, the Japanese holly fern, that it obviously is not native to Indiana, but is starting to appear in several locales in far southern Indiana on limestone. I'd mentioned Clifty Falls State Park as well as Charlestown State Park. In fact, I think this picture maybe was taken at Charlestown State Park. You may have seen this plant in cultivation, especially in greenhouses, but this particular one is hardy here, at least far southern Indiana. We are the Osmundas, big, bold, and beautiful. These are truly impressive ferns of the genus Osmunda. And look at the size of that thing. That is clearly our largest fern of Indiana, towering over a co-worker of mine, at former, I'm now retired, but Jason Larson. This was down in southern Indiana, but they get this big in northern Indiana too. This is the cinnamon fern. Osmunda cinnamomea. Some people put this in a new genus now. I'm old school. I'm still calling them Osmunda. But you'll find this in acidic environments up in mostly in northern Indiana, but down south you can find them in acid seep springs and in some cases on sandstone cliffs. But they call it the cinnamon fern because of these tall, fertile spikes of sporangia that are cinnamon color. So those you could call the fertile frond. Here are the sterile frond. There are no spores, sporangia or spores to be found on those sterile fronds. These are the only places where you would find the fertile spores. And see, if you can make them out in that picture, you can see all these club-shaped structures of sporangia where the spores are found. Interrupted fern is related. It looks a lot like cinnamon fern and not often easily determined. There are a few little tricks to identify them. Doesn't seem to require the moisture that cinnamon fern requires, but they call it interrupted fern because of the interruption of the frond. Instead of producing that single big spike that you saw on the cinnamon fern, here the frond is interrupted by the penna or penny of sporangia, as you can see here. Those are the fertile fronds. And in real life, you can see what it looks like. It's kind of odd, really. Here, it starts out with these sterile segments, then have the fertile segments, and then it continues again on as the sterile part of the frond. Most of the time, you won't see this. You won't see the fertile portions. They won't even be present. It'll just be like this. It's just a totally sterile blade. This is another Osmunda, the royal fern. It doesn't get all that large here in Indiana, but in Florida and in some other tropical areas, or at least warmer areas, wouldn't necessarily be tropical. I've seen some of them as big as a Volkswagen Beetle, just huge, big, massive plants. Raised from the dead. Here's the spooky part. Resurrection, a returning to life. And what are we talking about? Well, the resurrection fern. Here's what it looks like more often than not when you see it. And in Indiana, it's mostly a plant that you'd find on a rock face. And when it gets dry, these things curl up and look dead. So I just, I'll refer to it as the dead phase of this plant. It used to be in the genus Polypodium, and now it's in the genus Pleopeltis. But I always hated to see Polypodium go because I've always enjoyed saying Polypodium polypodioides. Isn't that fun? I mean, that's fun to say. It's just not near as much fun to say as Pleopeltis polypodioides. So, but that's erection fern. But here's what it looks like when it comes to life. Add a little water, or in this case, some rainfall, and there it just looks like a normal fern. If you go south, particularly down into the Gulf and Atlantic coastal plain, this plant covers the trunks and branches of live oaks, other trees too, but especially live oak. And I'm sure if you've ever traveled in that part of the country and you've seen live oaks, you've surely seen this fern. I can't imagine a live oak without it. In Indiana, Charles Dean, our great Charles Dean, our pioneer botanist, saw a location down in Posey County, down at the very southwest toe of the state, growing on a tree up on the branches, just like it would the live oak down in the Gulf coastal plain. In Indiana, I've only seen it one time where it was growing on a tree up high in the tree on tree branches, and that was in Harrison County. And that's the only time that I've ever seen it. They call these, again, I mentioned earlier about being epiphytes. This is an epiphyte most of the time. It's growing on another plant. It's not a parasite here. It's not pulling nutrition or minerals or moisture from within the tree. It might get a little nutrition from any silt and so forth that collect in the fissures of the bark, but it's not actually sapping the tree of any of its life juices, so to speak. This is the distribution of that resurrection fern. And you can see we're at the northern edge of the range of that species. I'm always fascinated by edge of the range species. And this is truly one of them. And actually you can add a county or two here. We've seen it, this is Harrison County. It's in Harrison County. In fact, that's where I saw it growing on the tree branches. Deem saw it down here in Posey County. So if you ever see this growing on tree branches somewhere, be sure and give me a holler because I would love to see it. Now here's a pseudo epiphyte. It's a poser. It's not really one that would classically grow upon another plant, or in this case a tree. In fact, this one usually grows on rock. This is the marginal shield fern, but there's such a fissure here at the base of this tree trunk that there's been accumulating organic matter and soil, so that this fern spore landed there and started to grow. So it looks like, hey, this is an epiphyte. And I guess in that particular instance it is, but classically it isn't. Looks like there's maybe a Christmas fern trying to do the same thing. Okay, we're going to look at our most common species of forest ferns. This is the one I saw today coming up out of the leaf litter. This is the southern fragile fern, Cystopteris protrusa. And it's a small fern, and but usually it'll form big colonies. And it's very common. You'll be able to find this. If you go take a hike out in the woods now or in the next few weeks, you'll find it. And they might get at most a foot in length, but usually they're 5-6 inches, something like that. Here's one just coming up. You see the spring beauties in bloom, and here's some toothwort. So this is the southern fragile fern. Christmas fern, Listicum acrosticoides, it's an evergreen. And that, because of that trait, it gets that name Christmas fern. It's been said that people would collect the fern fronds of this species and maybe make indoor decorations, especially around Christmas time, perhaps. And that can be done because it's evergreen. Now, they don't look quite so nice as this in the middle of winter, they start looking pretty ratty actually, but it is generally considered an evergreen fern and one of our more common ferns. Fairly large. These fronds could get at least a foot, foot and a half in length. Pushing it would be 2 feet. I doubt that, but we talked about this one earlier, the ebony spleenwort that I've seen growing in strip mine hills. This one's not a weedy fern. It usually grows in nice, rich, mesic ravines or on north-facing slopes. Call it the glade fern. It's gone quite a transition, through a transition of botanical names. I'm old school. I learned it as Ethereum pycnocarpon. And just as soon as I made myself learn Diplasium pycnocarpon, somebody comes along and says, no, it's Homalosaurus pycnocarpos. It's just frustrating, you know, for an old time botanist like myself. That looks like Christmas fern, doesn't it? If you know Christmas fern, like the one that we looked at just earlier, but easily told, see that Christmas fern has a little earlobe on each of the pinna or the subleaflet, or the pinna in this case. So easily told from that way. Silvery spleenwort, another fairly large fern in mesic forests, especially in southern Indiana. Deparia crosticoides. These fronds arch up at least 2 feet. I don't know about 3 feet, but 2 feet's pretty much a gimme. So a nice, big, attractive fern. Often grows with a glade fern that we just looked at. Sensitive fern, this one likes wet feet. Usually bottomland forests are home to this, or ditches. It's not a conservative species, at least in terms of necessarily high quality natural areas. And it's an interesting fern by producing these separate fertile fronds where the sporangia occur and where the spores are produced. Looks nothing like, as you can see, the sterile frond. Here you can see one starting to form of a fertile one. So we call it dimorphic. It has 2 different forms. The lady fern, Ethereum felix femina. Some people will split this into 2 different species. I still consider them the same species, but this is a common one. Mostly moist soils. The maidenhair. This is my wife's favorite fern, maidenhair. It's so graceful. There are other species of this, not in Indiana, but down in Kentucky and further south, you start adding different species. Grapes, grape ferns. Don't these maybe look like little clusters of grapes? Well, those are the sporangia, and it's of the genus Botrychium, the grape ferns. Okay, you might say, well, this is not correct. If you're up on your fern taxonomy, you know that this can't be right, because this has now been split into 3 different genera, sorry to say. But here's what used to be called Botrychium in Indiana of that genus. Now there are only 2, and they're little bitty ferns and very rare. This is one of the smallest. You can see it's called a moonwort, least moonwort. That from there to there might be an inch. And then here's this fertile stalk with the sporangia. And so that, okay, maybe it gets up, maybe that part gets to 4 inches or something. But tiny little thing, state endangered in Indiana, just in the northern half of the state. Now what the more common group of plants that used to be called Botrychium is now in the genus Septridium. And these are the ones. And the second one, Septridium dissectum, is the more common of them all. And this is what is generally called the grape fern or bronze fern. And that gets that name because as it's exposed to sunlight through the winter. This is green in the winter. That leaf tissue turns a rusty bronze color, and it's a pretty attractive fern. So now you have to call it Septridium dissectum. And these leaf segments sometimes are extremely dissected, much more so than this. But this is the classic look, more common look that you have. What was formerly called the rattlesnake fern, which is Botricium virginianum, is now Botripus virginianus, and here is it. Now, unlike the grape fern that we just looked at, this one comes up in the spring, persists through the growing season, and then dies down. There's no evergreen appearance, or not evergreen, but a winter appearance of this plant. And here you can see, look at this structure here with all the sporangia. Around the world and back. This is going to be about the most cosmopolitan of ferns. And each dot here represents a country in which it is known. So you can see it's all over the world, except for Antarctica. And some people have split it. Some people, I'm sure, want to make it into separate species, but for the most part, they all look to be the same. And that's the Bracken fern. It's not something you'd see very often in central Indiana, and not all that often in southern Indiana. Occasionally you will. But go north, especially northwest Indiana, if you go to the dunes, or you go to Jasper-Pulaski Fish and Wildlife Area or Willow Slough, this plant really likes dryish, sandy soils. And those are the places that you can see them, especially the dunes. This fern is all over the place. Okay, I'm going to show you a sequence of images here. And I want you to think to yourself whether it's a fern or whether it isn't, because there are some lookalikes. Now you got to ask yourself, is this a fern or not? Well, it just has this single little blade, but there isn't maybe a telltale structure here. There won't be any flowers there. That's where the sporangia occurs. So it is a fern. Believe it or not, that is a fern. Adder's tongue fern, Ophioglossum. This one's Ophioglossum engelmannii. We have a couple other species of Ophioglossum in Indiana. The most common one is Ophioglossum vulgatum. And it's actually pretty common, but most people never see it. It's only this frond, this blade, might be only 2-3 inches in height. But if you keep your eyes peeled and know what you're looking for, if you have a search image, in pretty much no time you'll come across some. Interesting plant. Adder's tongue in reference to someone alluding to the tongue of some snake, I guess, an adder. How about this tiny little thing that's on the tip of someone's finger? Is that a fern or not? Well, it is. It's the mosquito fern. Tiny little thing that floats on water. Can you see them here? There are a few scattered around. This picture was taken at Twin Swamps, and amongst all the duckweed and other little floating aquatics, here is the mosquito fern. But there's more in here than this one. You look around carefully, you'll see at least pieces of some. Oh, there's one there. There's a piece of one. There's one. So they're hidden, scattered around in there. There's a little bit closer view. So that's about the size of a dime, I would say. Not very big, not very common, but sometimes they proliferate unbelievably so. I have seen it, at least in southern Illinois, growing on the surface of a sewage pond, of all things, just totally covering it, making one solid mat. In Indiana, I've never seen it do such, but I have heard of people saying they had a farm pond one time that was covered with it. But they're somewhat ephemeral, and they may be thick one year and gone the next. So it's not something that's long persistent. In certain areas, Twin Swamps, you can almost count on seeing it. That's a nature preserve, beautiful cypress swamp that you must see, a naturally occurring one in far southwest Indiana. Yeah, look up Twin Swamps. It's a place you need to go. Now, what's this have to do with it? Well, in some countries, especially in Asia, they feed mass quantities of mosquito fern to livestock. And they also use it as a fertilizer in rice paddies because the fern actually houses nitrogen fixing bacteria, which, as you know, can take nitrogen out of the air and store it. And therefore, when those rice paddies are drawn down and the mosquito ferns die, they actually help provide a natural fertilizer for that rice paddy. And of course, again, here for livestock, here they're eating a bunch of mosquito ferns. Is this a fern? Well, that looks like a fern blade to me with all the segments and penny here. But there's a real problem with this. And the main one is that it has flowers. Remember we said earlier, no way, no how, true ferns do not have flowers. And so somebody's getting taken on this by thinking that they're buying a fern that's producing a flower. But what the heck, you can get 5 for almost $10, so that's not a bad deal, right? Brex.com, you probably know them. Is this a fern? Well, it didn't used to be considered such, but this is the common horsetail, Equisetum arvense. And here's what it looks like. These are young shoots. These are the fronds that have all these tiny little skinny branches, and the leaves themselves are very tiny. And it looks well named, I think, don't you? That horsetail fits the common name description of this plant. Well, not too many years ago, it was determined that this was indeed a true fern. And I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of this and why it's now believed to be a true fern, but just take my word for it. Here's another species of Equisetum called the scouring rush. I get phone calls, or at least used to when I was the botanist for the Division of Nature Preserves, of people saying they found bamboo growing in Marion County or Hamilton County or wherever in the state. Well, we do indeed have a true bamboo species in Indiana called giant cane, which is down in far southern Indiana, but this is not. But I can see how one might think this. It has these skinny, leafless looking, hollow, tubular stalks that do resemble somewhat the stalk of bamboo. But this is a fern, tall scouring rush, called scouring rush because it has actually within it little precipitations of, as you'll see in a moment, plant are called plant opals or phytoliths. It's actually secreting and forming bits of silicon dioxide or sand. Now, of course, this is extreme micrograph, electron micrograph of the surface of the scouring rush. But that's why it feels so coarse and rough. And it was used, and it would seem reasonable to me, as having utility to clean pots and pans. I wanted to go back to this one. This is a friend of mine, Perry Scott, excellent botanist, standing next to some of the tallest scouring rush I have ever seen. This is down in Jefferson County, and those things are practically over the top of his head. And look at the thick growth of that. That's an impressive growth of scouring rush. Okay, they are no longer our allies. Well, they used to be. We used to call these next few plants I'm going to show you fern allies. Now they call them lycophytes. They say they're not really related to ferns, and that's why we no longer call them fern allies. But me, again, being old school, that's what I used to call them. Fern allies related to ferns. This is called a meadow spike moss. I learned it as Selaginella apoda. Now it's Lycopodioides apodum. This one grows on dry sites, the rock spike moss. Extremely rare. I learned it as Selaginella rupestris. Now it's Bryodesma. I still call it Selaginella. This one's a very rare plant in Indiana. It likes to grow in solid, exposed rock faces that are flat and dry, or on sand, like in the dunes at Dune State Park. This is a weird one. Looks like an onion. The quillwort, that's well named, the common name, quill. These look like quills, don't they? This is Isoetes melanopoda, the black-footed quillwort. This grows in far southern Indiana, likes muddy and saturated soils. And no flowers again on this plant. It produces little spores there at the base. Actually has two kinds of spores, large ones and small ones, but the large ones are small too. Club moss, it does superficially resemble a moss, but it is not a moss. It used to be called Lycopodium lucidulum, that's Hupersia lucidula. And these grow in clumps, very shiny, they're evergreen, pretty attractive. From bottom to top, maybe 3-4 inches, maybe 5. Here's an entire colony growing. This is a detached sandstone boulder that broke off from the cliff. And there is just covered with that shining club moss. Someone thought this looked like a little cedar tree, so they called it ground cedar, but it's not. It's a lycophyte. I learned it as Lycopodium digitatum. Actually, I learned it as Lycopodium flabelliforme, but now it's called Diphaseastrum digitatum. And you'll find this, especially in southern Indiana, growing in old fields, and particularly where maybe some pines have been planted. It likes pine or acid soils that pines also prefer and create by their decomposing pine needles. Not rare. This one still is a Lycopodium, Lycopodium clavatum. And you can see why they get the name club moss, at least in the sense that it does look like a moss. These are true mosses here. See all these I'm highlighting? That's the hair cap moss. At least I think that's right. Maybe a biologist can tell me different. But this is the true Lycopodium, and it's a runner. You see it forms in these long, rapidly growing runners that can form large mats. And fairly rare in Indiana. Another tree club moss, or used to be related to the Diphaseastrum, but this one's Dendrolycopodium obscurum. Those, you'll often see these sold in craft stores. They'll sell them for like to look like trees and train sets and so forth like that. But it's not a tree, of course. It's a club moss. And they'll stand maybe 6 inches in height, form big colonies. Okay, now it's the moment you've all been waiting for. I gotta take a drink for this one. it's water, truly. This is in deep southern Indiana. And this is a sandstone rimmed sinkhole. You know, we have a lot of karst features in southern Indiana, but they're mostly associated in areas that are completely limestone. Well, where the Highland Rim Natural Region grades into the Shawnee Hills Natural Region, you'll get limestone buried below the sandstone. And so that's what's here. You got limestone below, so you got a sinkhole, and you have this sandstone. And underneath it is a cave-like environment. And there you can find what I call, well, I don't usually call it the cave fern, but for illustration purposes, I'm going to call it the land of the cave fern because it likes dark places. And typically where you'll find it in Indiana, of which there are only a handful of places, it grows back underneath overhangs that are very cave-like, to where it's usually dimly lit and rather humid. And it's there that you can find in the dimly lit spaces of the cave. That's right. You're going to find the cave fern in the twilight zone. And there really is the twilight zone, at least in caver terminology. Now, this is an extreme example, but here's the entrance zone. And notice it says green vegetation. The sunlight's variable, but there's green vegetation. Well, that's true. But you get back in the twilight zone, there's less light, minor temperature changes, and minimal plant life. There are only few plants that can grow in the twilight zone. And filmy fern is one of them. And here it is, the Appalachian filmy fern. I learned it as a trichomonas. Now they call it Vandenboschia boschiana. This is the filmy fern. This is what I always seek out whenever I'm in an area where there are sandstone cliffs, and especially where there are overhangs. They call it filmy fern because the leaf tissue is only one cell layer thick, and it's translucent. If you were to put something behind that blade, that leaf tissue, you'd be able to see it. Now, it's not totally transparent, more translucent, but it is only one cell layer thick. And it's a small fern. And it's in its entire range in North America. It is here outlined in blue. Now, almost all the other members of the filmy fern family, of which there are hundreds of species, grow in the tropics. You have to go down into the deep tropics or southern Florida to find most of the other members of the filmy fern family. But because we have these protected environments in the twilight zone, this plant can survive our harshest of winters and our driest of droughts, because it's in somewhat of a greenhouse effect back in underneath these overhangs. That is what fascinates me about filmy fern. Plus, I like to get muddy sometimes, crawl around on my belly to see if I can find some with a flashlight. And sometimes that's what you have to do to find them. And here's a coworker of mine, Roger Hedge. We're doing some monitoring of a filmy fern population. I want you to see, this of course is taken with a flash. You see anything else growing in this area? It looks like a desert, but here's the old filmy fern, and it's dark back there. The sun rarely will ever shine in this. Maybe when the sun is really low at a certain time of year in the winter, there might be a few rays of sunlight that could briefly hit it. But this is truly a twilight zone filmy fern. And there's a little bit closer view of the plant population. Each of those fronds is maybe 3 inches in length. And it's rhizomatous. That's why you get a patch like this. It's such a cool plant. And I can't top that, so I'm going to end it there. So thank you for your patience. I don't know, I may have gone over time. I don't know what to say. Yeah, I did.
That's okay, Mike. That was wonderful. And there have been a few questions coming in. If you want to stop sharing your screen, I'll invite people to turn their video back on if they would so like. Try and stay muted for right now. We're going to go through the questions that came in through the Q&A. And then once those are finished, then we'll invite you to unmute and ask any remaining questions you might have. So, Mike, looking back at the reproduction slide that you shared, does this take place at a certain time of the year?
Well, typically viable, and I'm no expert on fern reproduction by any stretch of the imagination, but my guess is that as those spores are produced on the growing frond, which comes up typically in the spring, the new ones do. And most of them are not evergreen, by the way. The ferns in Indiana are not. So I'm assuming that those spores that are viable are shed sometime during the growing season. It's certainly possible that some of the other ferns where the sporangia are persistent through the winter, maybe they can still shed spores, but I don't know whether those spores are viable or not. They might be. But regardless, those spores, wherever they land and grow, I would assume that that is during the growing season when they actually become a gametophyte. Again, I've never followed one that along that path to see. I've grown gametophytes from spores in a petri dish before, and in the house. You can take spores of some fern, let's say a Boston fern is an easy one to do, and just shake them into usually like a sterile peat or something like that, milled peat, and they can germinate and grow into gametophytes. But out in the wild, I don't know, but I would guess that generally most all that takes place during the growing season.
Okay, thank you. And so the next two questions are related. So I will read them both to you. Again, regarding reproduction, the image implies that even with the gametophyte phase, inbreeding is the default path for reproduction. How common is outcrossing, and how do ferns maintain genetic diversity, or do they? The next question was, can a gametophyte self-fertilize? So 2 questions.
Well, it's not uncommon. It's not uncommon for them to self-fertilize on the surface of that gametophyte. There are 2 structures there. One's called antheridium, and one's called archegonia, or a singular if you archegonium, antheridium. Sperm can travel to egg on that, and so it's, in a sense, it is selfing. But they can also, if those gametophytes are in proximity to one another, it is potential, certainly possible for there to be outcrossing, and that's how those hybrids are formed, where 2 different species gametophytes are close to one another, and there's sperm travels to the egg from one gametophyte to the next, for instance. But that's about all I know.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mike. What can you do to help ferns reproduce spread by spores? You touched on this a little bit just a minute ago, but can you elaborate?
Yeah. Well, if you can find a sterile, finely ground or milled sphagnum material. Like sometimes you can find that in greenhouses and so forth for sale or wherever, and moisten it. And if you have like a covering over a saucer or something, and keep it moist. Don't let that dry out. Don't let it get moldy either. That's why it's good to get sterile peat. In college, we used to use agar, which I don't think is very readily available to most people, but that's what we would use then. But if you want, you can do that. And that's still not going to guarantee you'll get a sporophyte to grow, but depending on the species, you could potentially. Or if you've got a suitable environment, let's say a woodland environment or something similar to the fern that you're trying to reproduce, where it would grow naturally, and just disperse them, shake them around and hope that maybe those spores will germinate and grow into gametophytes and ultimately produce sporophytes. It's not a quick process, but it can be done, I would think, but I've never tried it.
Okay, thank you. How many evergreen species of fern exist in Indiana?
That's a tricky one. I've never counted them. That filmy fern I just showed you, as with so much tropical ancestry as it has and tropical blood, it's evergreen here. You'd think it'd be better off going dormant in the winter, but apparently it's incapable of doing that. And that's why it needs to grow in those protected environments. Christmas fern is, there are not too many of them. Equisetum, those will maintain their green pigmentation. The Botrychiums or Septridiums, they're not truly evergreen because they go dormant usually in the spring and early summer and then come up in the fall. But if you want something to be evident in the winter, that one would be one that you might look up. Many of those spleenworts are evergreen. Walking fern is evergreen. Ebony spleenwort is, pretty much all of those are. But those are, not big showy things if you're looking for that to grow. Yeah, I'd have to sit down and go through the list and see what else I can come up with, but most of them are deciduous. Okay.
Couple more questions. Does sensitive fern do well upland as well? I had some dry out and die back in the pot before planting them, and they came back the next season.
Sensitive fern?
Yes.
I think they're relatively tolerant of dry conditions. I don't know about super dry. In nature, I don't usually see them on dry slopes, but I've seen them in uplands where there's like even a rut on a forest trail down in the hills of southern Indiana. You can find them. They're pretty tough, but I'd try to keep them some level of moisture on extreme periods of drought and heat.
Okay, good. Are there any specialty fern growers in Indiana that you know of? And maybe this is a question for the group as well.
Yes, I would not know that. I'm sure there probably are, but I'm going to have to pass on that one.
Okay, fair enough. So if you know of anybody, enter them into the chat, please. It looks like Mary Wells is saying, "Hey, Sinton fern and southern native and oh." Hey, Mary, are you asking are Hey Sinton fern and southern Indiana native? We might come back.
Well, just to answer that question, if that's what it is, yes, indeed, it is.
Okay.
It's not common, and it's almost always growing on a cliff or a rock face, as compared to the northeastern United States, where it can grow rather prolifically just on regular slopes. Here, it's very particular. It is in southern Indiana. I have seen it as far north as along Sugar Creek and near Turkey Run State Park. I've seen it. So it's it's certainly cold tolerant, but most of our populations are in southern Indiana.
Okay, thanks. One last comment. My horses like to eat tall, scouring rush. I'm hoping it's not poisonous. It's not poisonous, is it?
Not that I'm aware.
Okay.
So sometimes that scouring rush can get out of hand. So if your horses are eating it, maybe that's not a bad thing. You don't want it to eat all of it, of course, but because it's a cool plant in its own right, but it can get pretty aggressive and invasive in places. So.
Susie's asking, is ostrich fern a native Indiana fern?
Yeah, that is truly one of the most common. I'm glad that was mentioned because ostrich fern, of all the outdoor ferns that are cultivated, that's the most commonly cultivated one in my experience. And it does quite well. I've seen it around the foundations of many, especially older homes where it was, I think, more frequently used than today, perhaps. But it is native, but it is not commonly native. And I've not seen it more than a handful of places where it grows naturally. But I just mentioned Sugar Creek in Shade State Park and in Turkey Run State Park on the sandy floodplains that border Sugar Creek. I've seen some nice colonies of it there. And there's some scattered other places in the north. But in southern Indiana, I've never seen it grow naturally in southern Indiana. There might be a place or two, but I personally have not encountered it.
That's fascinating that it's so uncommon naturally, and it's so common and very vigorous in
Right.
the created landscape.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. At this point, well, we have a comment from Jean. Her land is on Sugar Mill Creek. And in the last 10 years, we have a lot of scouring rush in the floodplain, much higher up than usual.
Yeah, that's a phenomenon I've noticed over the years too. It does seem to be spreading. And I don't know, I don't have really an explanation for it. Usually when it starts creeping up the slope, there very possibly is some groundwater that's not at a super great depth there. I mean, ultimately it's going to hit its tolerance of moisture conditions to where it would stop, I would think. But I've noticed, especially around seepage areas at the bases of slopes, that the rush will grow up onto the slope. But I'm suspecting there's still some groundwater saturation there that it's pulling from. But it is spreading though, it seems to me.
Okay. Barbara is asking, do you have a favorite hiking trail in central Indiana that has several variety of ferns?
I would recommend Portland Arch Nature Preserve. Now that's central Indiana, but it's far west, over along the Wabash River. But it's a great natural area, scenic nature preserve. There's a place where there's a big wall of cliffs that's where you can see just huge cinnamon ferns growing actually on the cliff itself there, and just a whole host of other ferns as well growing there. But yeah, there are a lot of different fern species around to see, but that's one.
Okay, I'm sorry, you said that's Portland what?
Portland Arch, ARCH.
Okay, Portland Arch.
Uh-huh. Yeah, you can find that if you Google it. It's a beautiful nature preserve in its own right. Don't go there just for the ferns. You'll be impressed with everything that's there.
Okay, Jean is asking one more question. I also have even following a population of snow trillium, which seemed to pop up when creek gravel was added to a trail. Now leaf litter is taking over that gravel trail and the snow trilliums are waning. Could this be due to change in the pH?
Oh, well, yeah, that's a hard one to answer. Um, you're wondering if the leaf litter is changing the pH or is the gravel changing the pH? But it sounds like the gravel, it was there okay with the gravel, maybe. I don't know. It usually likes basic or limey soils, the snow trillium.
Okay.
So I don't know what kind of gravel was placed there. Most gravels you would get around here have some sort of calcareousness to them, unless you had ground up sandstone or something. But maybe the leaf litter, maybe it's getting too thick. Perhaps, I don't know. Snow trims really like, most of the time, like a slope where leaf litter doesn't accumulate to a great degree. I mean, they grow in leaf litter for sure, but a lot of times they seem to be most happy on a slope where the leaf litter tends to blow off or fall from gravity, through gravity.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mike. That's all we have in the chat. I'd like to invite, if anybody has any remaining questions, go ahead and unmute and ask away. Okay, well, thank you everybody for being here tonight. Mike, this has been just a fabulous presentation. Really
Well,
enjoyed it.
thank you so much. I appreciate all of your attention and putting up with some of my corny jokes. So
I love your corny jokes.
okay.
What fun it is. Okay.
Thank you all. Good night.
Good night, everybody.